Hello again, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Resilient Health Radio. I'm your host, Dr. Darin Ingels, and I am super excited to bring you part two of my conversation with Dr. Larry Palevsky, who is a pediatrician in New York City. And last time we had the opportunity to talk about a lot of drivers behind chronic children's health issues. And today we're going to do part two of that deep dive. So, Larry, welcome back to the program.
Oh, it's great to be here, Darin. Thanks for having me back.
So, last time we talked a lot about, diet and nutrition as drivers of a lot of chronic illness in kids. And I want to go a little bit deeper today and talk about drivers of autoimmunity. I know you've been practicing longer than I have, and you're a pediatrician, so you've seen more of this, but it's just amazing in the last, certainly 2 decades, the number of kids coming in with autoimmune disease is just mind-boggling. And as a non-pediatrician who sees a lot of kids, I just don't understand how the conventional pediatric world isn't just raising lots of red flags, because they've got to be seeing this day in and day out in their practices. And yet it seems that it goes virtually ignored. And, the kids get sent out with a prescription for some other drug, which of course isn't going to fix anything. What's your take on this? What are you seeing, beyond sort of what we talked about last time with diet? What are these other drivers of autoimmunity?
Well, Darin, what you raise is sort of the core philosophy in Western medicine, which is, asthma is on the rise, so we just learn to treat it better. Autism is on the rise, we just learn to treat it better. Neurodevelopmental disabilities on the rise, we learn to treat it better. Autoimmune diseases on the rise, we just learn to treat it better. Rarely is there that taking a step back to ponder, wait, when I trained, these diseases weren't, this common. Why are we seeing more kids with these chronic illnesses? And what might be the root causes or contributing factors to the development of these chronic illnesses? That rarely happens in Western medicine. What only happens is you have the diagnosis, here's our treatment. You have the diagnosis, here's our treatment. What caused it won't change our treatment. And that's essentially the philosophical ideology. Now, if you wanted to look at it from another perspective, again, that's the way they do it, that's fine. But it's not fine for everybody, and it's not fine for the way I practice medicine. And so if I see an increasing number of kids developing autoimmune diseases, the first thing I have to do is step back and say to parents, do you know what it means to have an autoimmune disease? What it means is that your immune system has found an enemy. And that's what your child's immune system is supposed to do. Find an enemy. And your child's immune system is fighting that enemy and fighting it hard. And it is attacking that enemy really well. Except that there's something in the description of that enemy that is similar or even the same as one or more parts of your child's body. And your immune system is unable to differentiate the initial problem, which was the enemy, and the self, which becomes grouped together with the enemy because your child's immune system has been taught to attack whatever signature is on that enemy. And if it finds that part of the body's anatomy has a similar or a same signature, the immune system is just going to attack the body. And thus, we have autoimmune disease. Now, question is, which I know you're going to ask me, is, well, what do you think is contributing to the rise of autoimmune disease? And the big answer is the one that's the elephant in the room, and that is vaccination. And here's why. Vaccines are contaminated with foreign cells. And those foreign cells are of different animals. And those foreign cells contain the genetic material that the immune system has to fight when the material is injected into the body. I mean, there are 3 specific vaccines that automatically we know have aborted fetal cells. And that's the hepatitis A, the MMR, and the varicella vaccines. And so if there are materials in those vaccines that the immune system recognizes as an enemy, and the genetic material somehow matches in that shot, cells, tissues, organs, DNA that are within range for our immune system to find and attack, we're going to develop an autoimmune disease. So that's one problem, is contaminants in vaccines can potentially have similar to or the same genetic material as our genetic material. That's one reason. 2, we are taught, Darin, that you're being given a vaccine because you could not have possibly already been exposed to the material we're vaccinating against, bacteria and the viruses, unless someone who was sick gave it to you. And if no one was sick to give it to you, and you have not been sick from those diseases, you do not have the genetic material of those bacteria and viruses that cause those diseases. Therefore, we're going to give you an introduction. We're going to inject pieces of it, or sometimes more than just pieces of that genetic material of those microorganisms. And when your body sees those microorganisms in the vaccine, once injected, you're going to mount an immune response against it. But the human body, in all likelihood, already has those bacteria and those viruses as part of its own self. And so we are essentially assuming that the children who we vaccinate with these shots with couldn't possibly have these bacteria and viruses. So the genetic structures are nowhere in the body. And that is never proven to be true. And so there's that possibility that we are raising the potential for autoimmune disease. It has been shown, and it's in the literature, Darin, that we know that microorganisms have similar to or same genetic structures as cells, tissues, and organs of the human body. So we're completely bypassing any solid evidence in the literature that says there's cross-reactivity, there's molecular mimicry, and we're making an assumption about how vaccines could work. That's an assumption that A, has never been proven to be true, and B, is more than likely false, because the human body contains hundreds of trillions of pieces of genetic material of microorganisms. And then the third possibility is the fact that the aluminum nanoparticle in the vaccines, which is in every vaccine except for the injectable polio, the MMR, the varicella, and the rabies shot. I believe the rabies shot. I may be right or wrong. Every shot, except for those 4, contains the aluminum nanoparticle. And the aluminum nanoparticle, and there's a whole huge textbook on the development of autoimmunity because of the effects of the aluminum adjuvant that's used in the vaccines.
Larry, can you explain a little bit about what an adjuvant is and why
Sure.
they add these things to the vaccines?
Sure. So many, many decades ago, when they took pieces of bacteria or viruses and injected them into the body, there were very few antibodies produced. And the effectiveness of a vaccine, so how you know a vaccine is effective, is by producing an antibody against the microorganisms that we're vaccinating against. And so when they injected just the bacteria and the viral particles, very little of an antibody response was seen. So they needed to find a way to catalyze the immune's response to the bacteria and the viruses. And they came up with an adjuvant. An adjuvant is a chemical that binds to the microorganisms that we vaccinate against. And when presented to the immune system, causes a bang of an immune reaction. So the body sees the aluminum and anything bound to the aluminum and causes an immune reaction by producing antibodies. And so the smaller the aluminum adjuvant, so microparticle, then nanoparticle, which is even smaller, the more immunogenic the adjuvant is. In other words, the stronger the adjuvant is to force the body to produce an antibody against the bacteria and the viruses when presented by the adjuvant to the immune system. And so that's why they use nanoparticles, because the nanoparticle aluminum adjuvant has a very strong immunogenicity. And so that's why the adjuvants are there, because without the adjuvants, there's minimal or very small immune reactivity to the microorganisms that we're vaccinating against.
So you're a pediatrician. You've been doing this a long time. Tell us, when you were going through your training, when you went through your internship, your residency, fellowship, how much education as a pediatrician did you really get on the contents of vaccinations? I mean, outside of learning, like, this is the recommended schedule from the CDC, what did you really learn about the contents of what you were administering to children, if anything?
So, Darin, I entered NYU School of Medicine in 1983, and I didn't know to look into the package insert until 1998, when a mother came to me and said, "Dr. Larry, did you know that there's mercury in vaccines?" And I said, "Really? No. And what else is in there?" And when you open up the pamphlet and just start reading chemicals, most of which you can't even pronounce, you start to realize that there's a toxic soup of chemicals in the shots that A, are toxic, B, have never been tested for safety to be injected into humans, C, have never been tested together to see how they amplify each other when injected into the body. And it's just a tragedy that we're injecting a soup of ingredients into kids that pediatricians, A, don't even know exists, B, usually turn their backs on when they do find out what those chemicals are, and C, give this very similar pat answer. Oh, come on. The amount of aluminum that's in vaccines is so minimal compared to what children are exposed to in their lifetimes that this shouldn't matter. And when I hear that a pediatrician says that, I ask parents to ask the following. One, "Excuse me, doctor, can you show me the study that substantiates the statement you just made, that injecting such a small amount compared to what kids are exposed to over a lifetime, it doesn't matter? Can you show me that study? And two, can you explain to me what happens to that aluminum nanoparticle when it's injected into the body? Does it stay? Does it leave? Does it get into the brain? Does it alter mitochondria? Does it interfere with growth and development anywhere in the body? If it does stay, how long does it stay? If it stays, does it continue to create immunogenicity? What are the dangers of it staying? People with Alzheimer's and a lot of neurodevelopmental disabilities in adulthood have as one of the problems in their brain aluminum. Is it possible that injecting this aluminum as children is somehow related over time to bringing their Alzheimer's and neurodevelopmental disabilities to the forefront because they started out with aluminum in their brain? And you'll see that the pediatrician has no answer and will usually throw the parent out of the room because they're challenging the God authority. But these are real problems, Darin, especially because nanoparticles are used. Let me just backtrack. You have the vaccine industry, which is a branch of the pharmaceutical industry, and you have the pharmaceutical industry using nanoparticles to make drugs so that the drug companies can make drugs pass through the blood-brain barrier into the brain, because it's well established in the literature that the blood-brain barrier prevents the passage of drugs from going into the brain across the blood-brain barrier from the bloodstream. So you have the pharmaceutical industry using nanoparticles and showing in many studies in rats and mice that when they use nanoparticles, some of which are aluminum, and bind it to drugs, there's very successful passage of those drugs across the blood-brain barrier into the brain. And then you have the same pharmaceutical industry using emulsifiers with the nanoparticles, and they're showing that when the emulsifier is with the nanoparticle, there's many-fold increase of drug delivery into the brain across the blood-brain barrier from the bloodstream than if you just had the nanoparticle alone. Okay, so that's the pharmaceutical part. But the vaccine industry is also using nanoparticles to inject into children to make antibodies. But it's the same nanoparticles that are used by the pharmaceutical end to make drugs to pass into the brain. Now, these same vaccines, Darin, that have the aluminum nanoparticle also have an emulsifier in them. It's called polysorbate 80. And so essentially, the pharmaceutical industry, of which the vaccine manufacturing process is part of the pharmaceutical industry, knows the technology to get drugs to go into the brain by using nanoparticles and emulsifiers. Well, across the hall, they're using nanoparticles and emulsifiers like polysorbate 80 in vaccines to create a good, effective antibody response. But then they walk away like they've dropped the Scud missile and they've blown up the entire, country that they bombed, only looking to target one thing. And now you have the passage of nanoparticles and polysorbate 80 into the brains of our kids, along with it, anything that's attached to the nanoparticle, the same way the drug is attached to the nanoparticle. And then, so getting back to what we started with when we first opened this dialogue, here we have 1 in 6 children in our culture with neurodevelopmental disabilities. And no one says, wait a second, 1 in 6, that crosses all socioeconomic populations, that crosses all cultural populations, that crosses all geographic populations. Why are we having such an increase in children with neurodevelopmental disabilities? That question doesn't happen. And yet the evidence is right there that the so-called aluminum adjuvant as a nanoparticle to manufacture an effective antibody, look over here, here's the antibody. Great, great. How fantastic is that? But you're not looking over here at the literature that your own company has that says by using a nanoparticle attached to, say, the bacteria and the viruses or anything else that's in the vaccine, you are directing that material into the brain. And so what does that create, Darin? Neuroinflammation. Do vaccine ingredients belong in the brain? No. Do vaccine ingredients help maintain good immunity against disease when they enter the brain? No. Do they interfere with motor development in children? Yes. Do they interfere with behavioral development in children? Yes. Do they interfere with speech development in children? Yes. Do they interfere with cognitive development in children? Yes. And the thing is that I'm not even giving my opinion here, Darin. This is simply looking at the literature and reading it and making very solid scientific statements about the very processes and technologies that the companies are using to make our vaccines that we're told are safe, that actually are time bombs in the neurological systems of our children.
Well, I know, people who are listening to this who may be very skeptical, and I know this has been very controversial for a long time. They say, well, wait a second. No, we've been vaccinating, really mass vaccinating since about early mid 1960s, is when the bulk of we used to just vaccinate against polio and smallpox, and that was pretty much it. And then we started getting MMR and DPT and everything else. These things have been studied, right? They've been studied for safety, they've been studied for efficacy. We've been doing it for so long. Why would a pediatrician recommend something that's not safe and effective?
Because of the very question that you asked me. Am I given any education about the ingredients? No. So the pediatricians, when they're taught about vaccines, are not taught to actually do their own research. They're taught these ingredients are safe. Therefore, they are. These ingredients have been studied, therefore they have been. And no, they've never been studied for health. They have been studied for other things, but they've never been studied for health. And that's a big blow to a major ideology of the Western medical system. Because what would happen if we didn't have vaccines? What would doctors do? What would pediatricians do? I don't know. When I was training in the 80s, the pediatricians that I worked with had come up in New York practicing pediatrics since the 1940s. I saw what they did. They talked to the parents. They talked to the kids. They answered questions. They played with the kids. They had heart-to-heart conversations. Nowadays, it's just mills. Come in, come out, come in, come out. Oh, you're here today with Johnny? Great, here are your shots. The nurse will give it to you. I'll see you in 3 months. I'll see you in 2 months. I'll see you in a week for your next shots. So it's become a factory mill. And, I am, again, I'm not sharing my opinion. That's the interesting piece about this. It's right there in the literature if anybody wants to see it.
Well, you sort of saw there was a study that came out this past week, and you'll remember, I can't remember, somewhere in Scandinavia,
Denmark.
Denmark, thank you,
Denmark.
that disproved any association with aluminum causing, any relationship to autism or neurodevelopmental disorders. And did you read the study? Are you familiar with it?
Well, I'm familiar with it because on Monday, I think July 21st. Yeah, on Monday, July 21st, I appeared on CHD TV to talk about some issues around children and vaccines. And there was a PhD scientist on right before me. His name is Karl Jablowski, I think it is. I'm sorry, Dr. Karl, if I mispronounced it. I know with a name like Palevsky, I would want people to pronounce my name correctly. But I think it's Jablowski. And he went through the data and he showed very, very distinctly how they lied and they hid the true data in order to publish an outcome that was favorable to their agenda. And there are a number of people, Darin, who have followed suit to publish how the raw data actually show that aluminum is dangerous when injected into the body through the vaccines.
Well, and we've got mounds of data showing that aluminum's been strongly associated with Alzheimer's disease, other types of dementia. It's a well-known neurotoxin just as a whole, and even the EPA has guidelines on how much aluminum you get through your pans, and aluminum foil and all of that. So, I mean, I don't.
Deodorants, deodorants.
Yeah, I mean, there's no mystery that aluminum is a well-established neurotoxin. So the fact that it gets used in, nanoparticles is quite shocking.
See, but that's what I think is not differentiated. The fact of the matter is that the aluminum in the vaccine is not the same as a naturally occurring aluminum in nature. It has been altered, and it's purposely been altered to create certain characteristics like immunogenicity, right? So this is not apples and apples. This is apples and orange. And I want to warn the listeners, the inhalation and the ingestion of naturally occurring aluminum or the absorption through the skin has as the potential for the body to remove it through the liver and more so through the kidneys and through the intestines and through the skin. But when you inject it into the body, realizing it's not the same aluminum, it's now a nanoparticle, you're expecting 100% absorption, and without any studies to show where that aluminum nanoparticle goes, where it stays, and how much and where it leaves, you're basically dumping 25 micrograms of aluminum per shot into children. That's a nanoparticle that has very different biochemical properties than the aluminum we see in the earth.
Yeah, well, I know this was a big discussion with mercury years ago. And again, there's different types of mercury. And again, your body has the capacity of getting exposed to mercury. This is kind of out there in the world. I mean, gosh, I can remember as a kid, we used to play with the broken thermometer and roll mercury in our hands. And our body probably got rid of it to a certain degree from what we got, through transdermal absorption. But like you said, when you're injecting it, when you're putting it in through different routes, it alters metabolism. It's a different way the body can handle the excretion of it.
Right. And you know what the sad thing is that whenever we talk about aluminum in the vaccines, we avoid including the understanding that if the body of the person getting the aluminum contains a very high amount of other metals, that aluminum could become even more toxic, because aluminum in and of itself is a neurotoxin. But aluminum and lead, or aluminum and mercury, or aluminum and fluoride is more toxic in combination than if it's just aluminum alone, which is why it's very difficult to really study it, because the aluminum being injected is not being injected in a vacuum. It's being injected in a system that has the potential to have more metals that in combination can create a much greater catalyzed inflammatory response. And that's why, you'd see, well, this kid was vaccinated with aluminum and he's fine. And say, number one, you don't know that. Number two, guarantee some of it still went into the brain. And just because you don't see a neurological event doesn't mean there wasn't a neurological event. And the other thing is that there may be fewer other chemicals in the body that even catalyze the aluminum. And, when I first started learning about the aluminum in the vaccines, a long time ago, I stumbled upon articles about aluminum and fluoride together. And what does every pediatrician give to the children in their practice who they are vaccinating? Fluoride toothpaste, dental treatments with fluoride in them, and fluoride vitamins, triviflor. So at the same time that you're injecting aluminum in through the vaccines, you're giving them fluoride vitamins. And you have to see what aluminum and fluoride together does. It just basically pokes holes in the brain. And then you question, well, why are 1 in 6 children with why do we have 1 in 6 children with neurodevelopmental disabilities? And do you see 1 in 6 children with neurodevelopmental disabilities in the non-vaccinated population, Darin? No, you do not.
Yeah. Yeah. It's, like I said, I'm a product of the late 1960s. I know when I got my shots as a kid, and I got everything that was recommended at the time. I think I got a total of 12 or maybe 14 doses of everything. And I think the kids now get upwards. I think it's 76 or 78 different things if you include everything on the recommended schedule. So, it's tough to compare my generation or even the generation after me with the current generation because they're getting a lot more than we got when we were kids.
And just to, come full circle, because your original question to me was about autoimmunity. I want to reiterate the fact that the aluminum nanoparticle does contribute to autoimmunity in and of itself.
Yeah. It's I know it's medically complex, and the thing I see and certainly hear from other practitioners, it's again, I've got other kids in my practice, they're fine, they've gotten everything as recommended, we don't see any issues. Certainly have a lot of kids in my practice that sometime very shortly after they received whatever shot, parents saw a distinct regression in their child. So it does happen. And like you said, there's no one product out there for anyone that's going to be, safe for everybody. You just never know. And I think that's when you start looking more into the genetics of everybody and the total body burden of everything else you get exposed to and what your grandparents and your parents were exposed to. We try and take into consideration all these factors when we're trying to evaluate, who's a good candidate for any therapy. How do we know it's not going to backfire and cause more problems than perhaps it's going to help? And I
Right.
think that's where medicine as a whole has kind of failed, is we've really lost that individuality of the person and being able to assess, all of your unique features
Right.
that decide really kind of, or at least help us make that decision on what's in your best interest.
Correct. Correct. And so I want to better answer your question about autoimmunity, because this is something right up your alley, and I'm going to ask you to talk about it. I'm just going to introduce it. And that's the fact that it has been established by a good part of the scientific literature that Lyme is a bioweapon, and the Lyme co-infections are bioweapons. And a number of years ago, one of your colleagues, or someone Troy Vincent, as a physician, started to treat Lyme as an autoimmune disease.
Yeah.
And he treated it with LDA, low dose antigen, and then low dose immunotherapy,
Right.
LDA, LDI. And what he found, that by treating kids with Lyme with LDA and LDI, they got better. And it made him question the autoimmune nature of Lyme and its co-infections. And I'm wondering if you can add to that, because I mean, you're in it. You wrote a book on it.
Yeah.
You know, Dr. Vincent, I'm aware of that. And
Yeah.
for the listeners, because for me, it's great. It's great education. So please.
Well, no, the idea of microbes being autoimmune triggers, again, we've known this for a very long time. Strep is our poster child, rheumatic fever, rheumatic heart disease, which is an autoimmune reaction to the strep bacteria. We've known this for many, many decades. And, Lyme, again, has a lot of research showing that it can initiate an autoimmune reaction. Now, whether it's a bioweapon or not is kind of irrelevant. The fact is, the organism itself has the capacity to trigger autoantibodies against the brain, the gray matter and the white matter, against the peripheral nervous system, against the joints. So, a lot of the symptoms people experience, and this is true, I'll say, for any infection, is it the infection itself that causes the problem, or is it the immune reaction? I think COVID's another great example. I don't think COVID, the virus itself, was the problem. It was the immune reaction to the virus, the cytokine storm. That's what became problematic for people. This idea that something like Lyme, it doesn't get into tissue in a way that it eats it up and dissolves it. It's not that kind of thing, but it can migrate to different parts of your body that trigger that autoimmune reaction, which is why we see such a broad, there's over 100 symptoms associated with Lyme disease. And so I think, this capacity for microbes to be an autoimmune trigger. And again, we could take a step back and go, well, wait a second, why does that happen? Or why are we seeing it more frequently now than perhaps we did 40, 50, 100 years ago? What is it about the immunogenicity of these microbes that seems to be more provocative than perhaps it was at the time?
Because I think there's a molecular mimicry.
Absolutely. There's
But
absolutely molecular mimicry, but again, why are we seeing more of it now? I mean, I will argue, I think it's just, again, the total body burden
Right,
has affected our immune tolerance as a whole to the degree that we don't tolerate all things. Look at all the kids with, peanut allergy. I didn't know a single kid growing up that had a peanut allergy, and now it's rampant. We've got kids that have more environmental allergies. We have more food allergies. We have more sensitivities, chemical sensitivities. Mast cell activation is like skyrocketing.
right.
All of this is a fundamental disruption that we as humans have lost our tolerance to our world, and
Right.
therefore anything can become an irritant.
Well, that's why earlier I said anything, I said that when the bacterial particles and the viral particles and what are attached to the nanoparticle as an adjuvant, it's going to cause the body to mount an immune response against it. And I said, and any other contaminant or other chemical that's bound to the adjuvant. Well, most people don't know that food proteins are in the shots. They are in the shots. So when you look down the list of the most common food reactions children have, it's dairy protein, casein, and some whey, soy protein, peanut protein, tree nut protein, egg protein, and sugar, because kids are developing allergies to sugar. Well, all those chemicals are in the shots.
Yeah.
And then you get, oh, come on. You don't think just a small amount of those foods in the shots is contributing. That's not the reason kids have allergies. Come on. And again, no science, just opinion. And the fact of the matter is that, I've seen so many kids with certain food allergies, Darin, that correlated with only one of the shots that they got and got no other shots, and then developed food allergy just from that shot. And the thing that's most preposterous is that the American Academy of Pediatrics and the Academy of Allergy, Asthma, one other A,
Yeah.
American
American Academy
Academy
of Allergy, Asthma, and Immunology.
Immunology, right. They say, oh, it's okay for a kid with multiple food allergies to get a vaccine that contains one or more of those food proteins so long that kid sits in the allergist's office with an EpiPen sitting there.
Right.
Now, if that isn't a murder premeditated murder, I don't know what is. And it speaks to what you said before about Lyme and the co-infections, is that it's not the allergen that is the danger. It's the body's immune response to try to get rid of the allergen that creates the symptoms that could lead to respiratory arrest. And, it's unconscionable for any doctor to say, well, the disease that we're vaccinating against is much more deadly than the potential for you to die from a fatal food allergy by getting the shot. So you need to get the shot. And this is madness. This is absolute madness.
Well, again, I know it's complex, but I think, when you're looking at, again, the impact of all this external stuff that might be injected through vaccines, risk of infection and what it can do to undermine the immune system. And as we talked about in our first discussion, the food and the contamination in the food, our poor kids are just getting bombarded with a lot of stuff. And it's just hard for their bodies to keep up with all that. And we're seeing that, in various ways and how it's impacting children's health. So,
right. Well, to speak to that, I just want to share with the listeners, the immune system has several arms to keep us well. There's the part of the immune system that's called the inflammatory immune system. That's the sort of front line. It's called the cell-mediated immune system. That's the part of the immune system that has got its fingertips on the front line. And if it sees something that's foreign, it's going to create a reaction. And it's going to inflame. It's going to attack. Then there's another part of the immune system that works to remove that material that's producing inflammation. All the cytokines, all the lymphocytes, the basophils, the eosinophils, the mast cells, right? All of the leukotrienes. So you have the inflammatory response, and then you have what's essentially the anti-inflammatory response, which is, okay, we're going to anti-inflame. We're going to get rid of the material. Now, there's then the regulatory system. So there's a piece of the regulatory system that has to tell the inflammatory immune system, okay, you've attacked enough. We're going to regulate your attack response. Then there's another part of the regulatory system that says, all right, well, you're eliminating all this inflammatory material. This is the humoral side. And now we're gonna stop you. All right, you've gotten rid of enough of the inflammatory material. Now stop. Those four arms have to be in balance. The fifth arm is the part of the immune system that repairs after all of this is done. After the inflammatory part does its thing, the regulatory slows it down, the anti-inflammatory does its thing, removes it, the regulatory system slows it down, and then there's a repair. Vaccines alter that balance. And so what it does is it damages the regulatory system and it increases the body's symptoms to allergens because it downplays the cell-mediated immune system and it upregulates the humoral immune system. So anti-inflammatory symptoms like coughing, sneezing, hives, mucus production, vomiting, diarrhea run amok because the body can't regulate the quieting of that system. And that's why we're seeing all these allergies, because the vaccines are altering the balance of those 5 steps of the immune system. And again, not my opinion. This is directly out of the scientific literature.
Yeah, well, fortunately, there's a lot of really great resources out there on this topic, with all the citations. And again, I know most pediatricians kind of give you a very one-sided viewpoint on this. There's always a counterpoint. And I think as we kind of wrap up here today, I'm just going to leave the final thought of like, look, this is complex stuff. And I think, if you've got a child who's been struggling with chronic health issues, it's a really good idea to get in the hands of someone like Dr. Palevsky, a good, holistic pediatrician, functional medicine practitioner, naturopathic doctor who, I think maybe has a broader understanding of all these underlying things we've kind of covered. And there's a lot of other things we didn't get a chance to talk about, but it's a deep pool. There's a lot to sort through, and that's where, again, I think we just need to respect the individuality of the person, and being able to understand what it is for that person that is the underlying causes, because it differs so much from child to child. There's no one broad thing that every kid suffers from. So we have to tease out what those pieces are for your child to help put together a plan so that we can really help your child get well.
Right. And I think the take home message, Darin, from what you just said is chronic illness is not a life sentence. The development of chronic illness is not a given. So your child is not destined to develop a chronic illness. Chronic illness can be prevented, and chronic illness can be safely and scientifically reversed. So you are not necessarily beholden to a drug that your doctor gives your kid and never says to you, okay, we're going to eventually work to get your kid off this drug. You'll rarely hear that. You'll mostly hear, this is a life sentence. It's not reversible. You have to live with it for life. And there's nothing that we can do other than medicate it and modulate it. Please understand, chronic illness is not a life sentence. It's not a given. It's not inevitable. It is reversible. And most importantly, it is preventable.
I couldn't agree more. Well, Dr. Larry, always a pleasure talking with you. You're always a great source of information. And again, I appreciate you coming at this with science. It's, you've got obviously years of clinical experience, but I know you're an avid researcher. You read the literature, you analyze it. You're very critical in your thought process, and that's what makes you a great pediatrician. So I appreciate you being here.
Thank you. Appreciate you having me.